The title for today's talk, Politics According to Kids. You know, you hear a lot from your friends, your family about politics and what they think. And, you know, sometimes maybe it's even a little too much of that on things like social media. But what I did with this study that I'm going to tell you about today is to really learn about what kids think about politics. What are their impressions of politics? And I'm just excited to see so many familiar names and faces here today, and thanks for joining. So I'm gonna get my screen working here. There we go. So I just finished my 13th year at the College of Wooster, and I was really drawn to Wooster because of its strong focus on undergraduate research. And I really continue to value those mentoring relationships and working with students on things like experiential learning. Like Sharon said, I've been working as the Associate Dean for Experiential Learning for a few years. And I just threw in some photos of some of the things I've been doing with students. So on the far left, I took 25 students from Wooster to the National Political Party Conventions in 2016 as a part of our Wooster Studies, the National Party Conventions program. In the middle, these are two students that I advised in a applied methods research experience project focused on state policy solutions for a local nonprofit to gain funding. And then the final one is a photo of a sophomore research assistant who worked on the project I'm going to talk about today. So the premise of my study and what I'm going to tell you about today is that kids are interesting in their own right. A lot of political scientists focus their studies on adults, and actually it's interesting because political socialization research kind of peaked in the late 1950s and the 1960s. And as a discipline, I think that's kind of a failure. And ever since, political scientists have just kind of said, yeah, a lot happens when you're a kid, and we didn't know much about it. And so my work that I'm going to talk to you about today kind of hinges on this idea that the childhood years are really formative for kind of developing a political identity, to think about attitudes towards political leaders, and kids' orientations towards whether they want to participate in politics when they grow up. And one of the focus areas of this study you'll see is also about gender. One of my main concerns as a scholar is women's lack of descriptive representation in our governing bodies. And part of this study focuses on whether and how those gaps that lead to that start when kids are little. And I'll show you some of those results later. So a lot of things go into a child's socialization, right? So these images kind of show you maybe images where kids are with their friends, they learn about politics maybe from their families. We also know that, let me see, oh, sorry. Kids learn about politics in school. And one of my research areas has been to look a little bit at what are those messages that kids are getting in school. I've done some research where we analyze the composition of textbooks with regard to how gender is represented and things like that. And so it's important to think about what's covered, what's not covered. How do images like this one in the middle, where we see predominantly white men creating US politics, how do those influence kids when they're first learning about politics in school? And so today my goal is to just give you a sampling of some of the findings from the study that I have been engaged in most recently. It's not going to be very comprehensive, and of course if you have questions later, definitely follow up with me. But one of the take-homes with regard to gender in my own research is that when the curriculum doesn't focus on the role that women have played in US politics, and when it doesn't show women having political agency in politics, that can send a message to girls that they kind of incorporate into their self-image that, you know, politics is for boys or men and not for them. So that's one of the things I'll talk about today. But my study is much more broad than that. So 4 different questions I'm going to talk about. How do kids envision political leaders? How do children view the US presidency? Are kids partisans? Are they already forming partisan identities in their childhood? And then the final piece related to gender, how do girls and boys view politics differently? And just a quick shout out to my collaborators on this project. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with the clicker here. These are my collaborators. It's a large-scale data collection that we did across 4 different cities and research locations in the US. And these are a great group to work with. I also have to thank a lot of sophomore research assistants who have worked with me on this project over the last few years. And of course to alumni like yourselves who have given funding to the Henry Luce Fund for Distinguished Scholarship, which funded the data collection for this project. So let me see here, let me click. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about some surveys and interviews that we did with kids across our 4 different research sites. So we wanted to ask elementary schoolers, so grades 1 through 6th. And we did paired interviews with the youngest kids, and then we did surveys in a group with the older kids. The kids actually received a bag of crayons. You can see the crayons that I have shown there. That'll be important for me to talk about later, but it included the kind of standard Crayola crayon colors and then the multicultural skin tone crayon pack. And we did, we were in 15 different schools in 4 different cities. We interviewed and surveyed 1,500 kids, which was a really bureaucratic kind of nightmare to get permission from all the school districts and all the principals and to make arrangements with all the teachers, to have all the volunteers there to do the data collection. It was really, really challenging and really rewarding at the same time. So today what I'm gonna do is tell you about some of the key things we asked the kids, and then I'll give you the answers that help to answer those 4 questions that I mentioned earlier. So the first thing was we had the kids use those crayons, okay? We gave them this prompt, close your eyes, imagine a political leader at work. A political leader is someone who wins an election and then has the job of helping people and solving problems. I know this prompt by heart because I said it hundreds and hundreds of times. And anyway, then the box below, they were asked to use the crayon bag to draw what they pictured. And so this was the first thing we had them do. And later on, I'll show you examples of this as a way to get at the idea of how do kids see political leaders. The next thing we asked kids to do was to do a series of measures that were used in a classic political socialization study in the 1960s. And the scholars who did this created kind of a leader imagery battery, which was meant to kind of look at how important are political roles compared to other roles that people hold. And what they found in the 1960s was that political leaders, the president, they were seen very positively, extremely positively, like off the chart and seen as very important. It also showed that political leaders were seen much more broadly than you might think of today. So not just politicians, but other things, even like police, firefighters. Kids kind of thought everyone who had authority kind of fell in this broad category, and they saw them very positively. So we asked them this question to see how much value do they place on these roles compared to other roles. We also asked questions about, from the Greenstein 1960s piece, about their image of the president. So how knowledgeable, trustworthy, honest they see the president as being. And so you'll see those items here. Does the president work harder than, as hard as, or less hard? Is he more honest, less honest, as honest? And then the final one was, is the president the best person in the world, a good person, or not a good person? So in the 1960s, the president was off the charts on these measures. And I'll show you a little bit about what we see in our data. Okay, we also asked about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama as two other kind of not in power at the time of our data collection. We asked about evaluations of them, and you'll see how those become important later in my analysis. We asked about party identification. So we asked about two parents or adults who they live with, and then we asked what party, political party they identify with. And then we asked the child to also to describe any differences that they know about Democrats and Republicans, or if they don't know, in an open-ended question. And then we asked them, you know, when you're old enough to vote, which party do you think that you would choose to vote for? So this was a little bit more when we get into the gender gaps piece, do girls and boys see things differently? We were interested in kind of political ambition or ambition towards a career in politics. And so we asked them to select the different jobs that they would consider when they're older. And then we asked them if they'd like to have a job in government when they grow up. And two other quick ones. We wanted to test political knowledge, so their knowledge of the political system. And we did this largely through visual images because we were dealing, sometimes with 6-year-olds. We had to have things that they could actually answer. And so these are some examples of political knowledge, like who lives here with the image of the White House. And then finally, we wanted to look at how kind of interested kids were in politics, about learning about politics, and about thinking about politics and seeking out more information. And so we used these were skills that we adapted from STEM education for interest and enthusiasm for science. So now I'm gonna show you some pictures of what the kids drew as a way to illustrate what we see in the data. It's gonna be really fun. They're actually really fun to look at. I wanted to quickly highlight here, this is my student Jifa Ajay. She, once we were done collecting all the data, she actually was my sophomore research assistant for a summer, and she spent the summer, she was coding the images on a bunch of different factors, and then she also entered all of the data from the surveys and interviews. And she's currently bound for a PhD program at Penn State University, and she's fantastic, now Wooster alum. And so with that, I'm gonna show you a little bit of the results. And like I said, for each of those questions, I'm just gonna give you a small insight into what we see. So the first, how do children envision political leaders? So I'm gonna show you some pictures. We see a lot of what you might expect. Political leader drawings with flags, suits, you see the kind of Abe Lincoln hat. Here, we asked students to describe the leader. Here, the political leader was described as talking about laws and freedom. Here's a 4th grader drawing who drew a mayor talking. There were a lot of words coming out of this mayor's mouth. We have here, this is a mayor meeting, MEATING, people from the community to get to know them. So we learn a lot from how they describe the drawings as well. This was a 2nd grader in Ohio who drew a purple governor. And if you know anything about Ohio as a swing state, purple was kind of an appropriate color, whether the kid knew it or not. The students draw and describe political leaders as working in offices, here at a desk, on a computer, writing laws, signing papers. Our data show that the kids add more specificity to these tasks as they get older. And consistent with that 1960s study that I mentioned, kids will draw a firefighter sometimes, especially younger kids. Or a police officer, or here a sheriff, SHARIFF. And the views of kind of the broad array of authority figures was pretty positive in our rural, suburban, and exurban schools, but not in our urban schools in Boston and New Orleans, where race relations with law enforcement are strained. I'm sure you wondered, did the kids draw Donald Trump? A lot of kids drew Donald Trump. And here's a positive one, okay? Many are not positive. This one was drawn by an 11-year-old. They're pretty creative in how they express emotion in these drawings. Here you see a boo from the crowd and tomatoes being thrown. And in drawings of Trump and otherwise, kids often bring in dimensions of global politics, specifically China, North Korea, and Donald Trump's wall were very big stories in the news during the data collection period for the study. And while the demographic items that we asked in the survey, a lot of kids don't identify with a party, or they can't identify which party they like, they still are very negative towards members of the party that they don't like, if that makes sense. So they may not know that they or their parents are Democrats, but they already are making negative assumptions about Republicans. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So in this one, you can see animosity towards what they perceive as a member of an out party. We'll get back to that later. We have a lot of pictures of Barack Obama here, break Obama. We also have a lot of historical figures. Abe Lincoln and George Washington were popular. Younger children were more likely to draw them. As kids get older, they seem to have more contemporary examples of leaders to draw from. And occasionally, kids draw a woman, but only on average about 10% of the time. So it's not very often. And she's usually a white woman. Young girls were slightly more likely to draw women than boys, but as they age, they become less likely to draw women political leaders. And I'll show you some more data on that later. Some, but very few, only 13 out of 1,600 children drew Hillary Clinton once she was wearing rainbow pants. She's drawn much less often than we would expect given her recent presidency, presidential candidacy. Notes. Okay. Also rarely do kids draw imagined political leaders of color. Along the lines of the literature in STEM, where they've asked kids to draw a scientist in a similar exercise, political leaders of color are more often drawn by children of color. And in our images of historical figures, Martin Luther King Jr. is the only historical figure of color that we see among the 1,600 images. So that just gives you a glimpse into what we see. We've coded these images on a lot of different dimensions and are in the business of analyzing it from every perspective that we can. But some of the takeaways here are that we do see a lot of negativity towards political leaders. And this negativity is much more than prior, much earlier studies of political socialization. We also see partisan polarization come through, that animosity towards the leaders of what they perceive as the other party. We also see that, the media coverage, what's going on in the world at the time of our data collection is also reflected in what we see. Kids are filtering that in through what they draw. And as you saw, kids mostly draw white men, and that reflects, who has held and continues to hold office in the United States. We see very few women and leaders of color. And we think that has implications for whether girls and kids of color can picture themselves in those roles. And then finally, the kids do gain sophistication over time. They're able to more accurately talk about the tasks of the political role as they get older. Okay, so quickly on I just have 1 or 2 slides on the other questions. So how do children view the US presidency? So what we did was kind of summarize, and this is an article in The Conversation that was published in April. So if you want to read more about this study, you can search for that there with my name. And so what we see overall in this study is that children in grades 1 to 6 no longer possess those favorable views of the president that researchers saw in the 1960s. However, the institution of the presidency, separate from our current president, Donald Trump, still seems to be held in high esteem and seen as an important role. And I'll show you just a few slides, 2 data slides that help us to show that. These were some more examples of some of the images of Trump. I told you there are a lot of kids drew Donald Trump. I believe it was near 500 of 1,500 drew Donald Trump. So we've been talking about, that's a paper in itself that we haven't worked on yet. But here are some brief examples of some positive and some negative ones that we saw in the data. And of course, once we've coded all these images, and then once we had all those survey questions entered, we were able to analyze those in a more sophisticated kind of way. But I've tried to boil this down here. So what you see here is that the top line is basically what percentage of kids in here, 1958, in 2000, and then for our data, felt that the role of the president was an important one. Okay, and so what you can see is that it's still pretty high, right? When we put all of our grades together, it's a little bit lower. We found in our data that 4th graders tend to be the most positive, and we're not sure why that is. We're still thinking about that, but so the presidency as a whole seems to be held pretty high yet. However, when we look at specific evaluations of Donald Trump, we see a pretty dramatic shift over time. And so if you look here, this is, 67% of kids in 1959 said he worked much harder than others. But then if you fast forward to today, it's 39%. So some of these are changing by 30, 50 points, and really just kind of skewing in completely the opposite direction. So the kids in our study, this was in the fall of 2017 into January of 2018. So we're looking back in time just a little bit. But we see that, there's some pretty significant changes here, that a 30% drop in seeing the president as the best person in the world. So it's a pretty dramatic shift. So next, our kids partisan. Okay, so our kids actually developing a political identity as a partisan person. And so what you'll see here, the vertical dotted lines indicate a neutral evaluation for Donald Trump. This is a composite, so this is kind of including knowledge, honesty, all of these different measures into one. And so what you see here, just kind of eyeballing it, is that Republican children on average are more positive about Donald Trump when we combine all those measures together. And it holds for all these other measures. We look at Democratic children who said, yeah, when I'm old enough, I'm gonna vote for a Democrat. They were more negative about Donald Trump overall, and then on each individual measure. You see the kids with no partisan affiliation tend to be more positive. And I'll show you later, they tend to be more positive towards all the different folks. They're more positive toward Hillary Clinton, they're more positive towards Barack Obama, etc. So here's a little bit about that. When they're evaluating the president, so Republican children were positive. This dotted line, remember, is neutral. Democratic children were negative, but then we look, Democratic children become positive about Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. but Republican children are negative in their evaluations of Obama and Clinton. And then we see here again, those children who didn't report a partisan affiliation, they're either kind of near neutral or pretty positive towards the different political leaders. The last piece I'm going to talk about is the gender piece. And so what I'm going to talk about here is all the different things that we measured, whether or not boys and girls were different on those. Okay, so here again, the dotted line is the kind of the comparison point you want to think about. So the dotted line is where boys and girls don't differ. Okay, so girls, if girls were completely in line with boys, as they are here, okay, with political knowledge, that means that they didn't score any different from boys on average. And this is pooling grades 1 through 6 all together in one analysis. And so what we see is that on political knowledge, girls were no different than boys on average. Okay, so that's a really positive thing. However, we find that on all the other measures, so this one over here on the left is whether they drew a woman political leader in the Draw a Political Leader task. Okay, so girls were slightly more likely than boys to draw a woman political leader. Okay, but on all these other ones, so they were less likely to say they want a job in politics when they grow up. They checked fewer political careers in the different careers that they would consider in the future. They demonstrated less interest in politics. Those measures like, do you want to read and learn about politics? All those different ones that we talked about earlier. As a gender scholar, we think here we see some evidence of the kind of the origins of some of the gender gaps that we see between adult men and women in terms of political interest, ambition to seek political careers, and things like that. So just a few final words, and then I'd love to hear your questions and have a discussion. So, you know, the number one thing that I think we keep saying to people when we talk about our work is that kids are listening. You know, I think I know with my own kids, I find myself sometimes talking negatively about politics, and I have to kind of check that. And so they're listening. They're important beings to study in politics. And, you know, we've tried to make this point in our discipline that we really need to know more about what kids think and why. One of the things we're working on is also how can we shift some of the dynamics that we see in our data. The next is that kids view politics in gendered ways, and it negatively affects girls and their intentions to participate and their interest in studying and learning more about politics and going down the path that might lead them to political office. The actions, the fourth bullet, the actions of political leaders matter for how children are socialized to view and value politics. You know, I think pretty much everything our Congress is doing and the gridlock and polarization is not a good dynamic for kids to observe. I don't know who's drawn to that, who wants to go into that and thinks they can fix that and make a difference. And that's related to this, you know, we're in a hyper-partisan atmosphere right now, and, you know, kids see that and they're starting to reflect that. And, you know, ultimately our group is hoping to take these results and think about how do we change the dynamics for kids, and how can we help create some curricular interventions and other things that parents and families can do with their kids to shift these dynamics. Because, you know, the last point, kids are the future. And if we do nothing, if we just let things go as they're going now, they're going to recreate the US politics that we have right now. And I think we all can understand that probably wouldn't be the most positive thing. And so, yeah, with that, I did include, and I can talk more about this, I mentioned we're going to be doing different curricular interventions. We're going to test some experimentally to see how we can shift some of the gender dynamics that I talked about. And our goal is ultimately to create a set of kind of resources for teachers and parents in the future. And with that, on the gender piece, I did just include some images here of some of the books that we recommend that you might include in your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors' kids' libraries to represent a more gender inclusive and diverse politics from that kids would start to see that at an even younger age. So, but with that, I would love to hear your questions.